Inside J.C. Penney's mansion, there was nothing accidental about its grandeur. Every polished surface, every wide corridor, every quiet room reflected a man who had climbed from absolute poverty to unimaginable success. James Cash Penney did not inherit privilege. He earned it through discipline, belief in fairness, and an almost obsessive commitment to honest business. Yet the mansion that crowned his achievement would eventually become something he no longer wanted and could no longer keep. Penney grew up knowing hunger, limitation, and the weight of responsibility at a young age. That early hardship shaped his values long before it shaped his ambitions. When his retail empire expanded across America, success followed at a speed few could control. The mansion stood as proof that the boy, who once worked for survival, had become a symbol of American opportunity. But inside those walls, comfort never quite settled in. Unlike many tycoons of his era, Penney struggled with wealth. He believed money was a tool, not a reward, and the mansion often felt like a contradiction to the principles that built his name. While guests admired its size, Penney questioned its purpose. He was not driven by indulgence. He was driven by service, reputation, and the belief that business should improve lives, not separate people from them. As the company grew larger, the pressure grew heavier. Expansion demanded constant borrowing, constant risk, and constant optimism. When the economy collapsed during the Great Depression, optimism was no longer enough. The same system that once magnified his success now amplified his losses. Penney watched his fortune evaporate, not gradually, but violently, as debts tightened and confidence disappeared. The mansion changed during those years. What once symbolized achievement became a reminder of vulnerability. Silence replaced celebration. Rooms felt oversized for a man, shrinking under stress, illness, and public scrutiny. Penney suffered emotional and physical breakdowns. Not because he feared poverty, but because he felt he had failed the ideals he stood for. Giving away the mansion was not a dramatic gesture made for headlines. It was a quiet surrender to reality and conscience. Financial necessity played its role, but so did belief. Penney no longer wanted to live inside a monument to excess when millions were struggling. Letting go of the mansion was a way to realign his life with the values that defined him long before success arrived. The mansion did not define J.C. Penney. His willingness to release it did. While his empire would recover and his name would endure, the most revealing chapter of his life was not written in profit or property, but in humility. The retail king gave it all away because he understood something rare. That legacy is built not by what you keep, but by what you are willing to let go. J.C. Penney rose from extreme poverty in a way that feels almost unimaginable by modern standards. He was born into a household where money was not just scarce, it was a constant source of anxiety. His father, a strict minister, believed that hardship built character, and young James Cash Penney learned early that survival depended on discipline, honesty, and relentless effort. As a boy, he was not shielded from struggle. He worked to contribute to the family's needs, learning firsthand what it meant to earn every cent and to feel the weight of responsibility long before adulthood. There were moments in his youth when ambition felt less like a dream and more like a necessity. Poverty did not inspire romance or rebellion in him. It taught caution, restraint, and endurance. He understood the dignity of work because he had no choice but to work. These early experiences shaped a mindset that would later define his business philosophy. Fairness mattered, trust mattered, and profit meant nothing if it was built on exploitation. Long before he sold his first product, Penney believed that character was a form of capital. When he entered the world of retail, he did so without connections, wealth, or protection. He started at the bottom, learning the rhythms of commerce through long hours and close observation. He paid attention to customers who counted their coins carefully, because he had once been one of them. He noticed what made people feel respected and what made them feel small. This awareness became his quiet advantage. While others focused on squeezing profit, Penney focused on building loyalty. His rise was not sudden. It was built store by store, decision by decision, mistake by mistake. He rejected the deceptive pricing tactics common in his era and insisted on honest value, believing that long-term trust would outlast short-term gain. This principle, simple yet radical at the time, allowed his business to grow steadily. Customers returned not just for goods, but for dignity. They felt seen, not used. As his stores spread across the country, Penney's influence expanded beyond retail. He became a symbol of a particular American promise. That integrity and hard work could elevate a person from obscurity to power. Yet even as his wealth multiplied, he carried the psychological imprint of poverty. He never fully escaped the fear of loss or the awareness of how quickly security could disappear. That tension fueled both his caution and his drive. Reaching the height of American retail power did not erase his past, it sharpened it. Penney stood among industrial giants, yet his instincts remained shaped by scarcity rather than abundance. His decisions reflected a man who remembered what it meant to have nothing, and who feared becoming disconnected from ordinary people. That memory kept him grounded, but it also made success heavier to carry. By the time J.C. Penney became one of America's most powerful retail figures. His journey was not just a story of financial ascent. It was the transformation of hardship into discipline, of poverty into principle. His power did not come from dominance or excess, but from understanding people at their most vulnerable. Because he had once lived there himself, his mansion symbolized success in a way the public immediately understood. It was large, elegant, and unmistakably a marker that J.C. Penney had arrived at the highest level of American achievement. To outsiders, it represented victory over poverty. Proof that discipline and hard work could transform a struggling boy into a national figure. The mansion stood as a physical reward for decades of sacrifice, long hours, and relentless responsibility. It told a simple story to the world he had won. Yet inside those walls, the meaning was far more complicated. For Penney, the mansion was not just a home. It was a mirror reflecting tensions he had never resolved. He had built his life on values of modesty, restraint, and service, and the scale of the mansion quietly challenged those beliefs every day. Each expansive room raised an unspoken question about necessity versus excess. Comfort existed, but so did discomfort. An unease that success had pulled him away from the moral simplicity he once lived by. Penney's upbringing had trained him to associate wealth with responsibility rather than pleasure. Money, in his view, was meant to circulate, to support communities, employees, and customers, not to elevate one individual above others. The mansion, however, placed him physically and symbolically apart. It created distance between the man who believed in equality and the image of privilege he now inhabited. That distance weighed on him more heavily than admiration ever could. As guests admired the mansion's refinement, Penney often felt the quiet pressure of contradiction. He was celebrated as a retail king. Yet internally he wrestled with whether such personal luxury aligned with his conscience. The mansion became a space where success was undeniable, but satisfaction was uncertain. Instead of representing rest, it often amplified reflection. Silence in its corridors left room for moral questioning rather than peace. This internal conflict grew sharper during moments of national hardship, when economic conditions worsened and ordinary Americans struggled. the mansion felt less like an achievement and more like a moral test. Penney could not ignore the contrast between abundance and need. What once seemed like a justified reward began to feel like a burden, a constant reminder of inequality he had spent his career trying to soften through fair pricing and ethical practices. Over time, the mansion stopped functioning as a symbol of fulfillment and became a symbol of tension. It represented how far he had come, but also how far he feared he had drifted from his core beliefs. For J.C. Penney, success was never meant to separate him from others, and the mansion, despite its beauty, embodied that separation. In this way, the mansion reflected not just his financial status, but his inner struggle. It stood at the intersection of achievement and doubt, wealth and morality. To the world, it was proof of triumph. To Penney, it was a constant reminder that success without moral alignment could feel hollow, no matter how grand the surroundings. Penney's personal values were shaped long before success ever entered his life, and they were anchored deeply in humility, faith, and responsibility rather than luxury. Raised in a household where moral discipline mattered more than comfort, he learned that worth was measured by conduct, not possessions. Faith was not an accessory to his life. It was a framework that guided how he viewed work, money, and human relationships. From an early age, he absorbed the belief that prosperity carried obligations, not entitlements. Humility remained central to his identity even as his influence expanded. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Penney did not see himself as superior because of wealth. He saw himself as accountable. Success, in his mind, was something to manage carefully, not something to display. This mindset shaped how he treated employees and customers alike. He believed leadership required restraint and example, not dominance or excess. His faith reinforced this restraint. Penney believed that wealth was temporary and moral character was enduring. That belief created a constant internal checkpoint. Every major decision had to pass through questions of fairness and purpose. He resisted indulgence, not because he lacked access to it, but because he feared it could weaken judgment and distort priorities. Luxury, to him, was dangerous when it distracted from service. Responsibility was the bridge between his beliefs and his actions. Penney felt personally responsible for the livelihoods of thousands of employees and the trust of millions of customers. He viewed his business not just as a profit engine, but as a moral system that needed to function ethically. This sense of responsibility extended beyond his company to society itself. He believed a businessman's role was to stabilize communities, especially in uncertain times. Even in private life, his habits reflected moderation rather than excess. He preferred simplicity, routine, and purpose over spectacle. While others chased prestige, Penney chased alignment between belief and behavior. He was uncomfortable with symbols of extravagance because they conflicted with his internal compass. Wealth, when isolated from responsibility, felt empty to him. As his fortune grew, so did the tension between external success and internal discipline. Yet he consistently leaned toward principle over pleasure. His values did not evolve with his wealth, they resisted it. This resistance defined him. It kept him grounded, but it also made the rewards of success feel complicated. Ultimately, Penney's legacy is inseparable from these values. Humility kept him aware of his origins, faith gave him moral direction, and responsibility defined his purpose. Luxury never became his measure of success. Integrity did. The retail empire's rapid expansion looked triumphant from the outside, but beneath the growth lay intense financial pressure and unrelenting personal stress. As J.C. Penney's stores multiplied across the country. Each new location required capital, coordination, and confidence in an uncertain future. Growth was not fueled by excess cash. It was driven by borrowing, reinvestment, and constant risk. Every decision carried weight, because one miscalculation could threaten the entire structure he had built. Expansion demanded more than vision. It demanded endurance. Penney found himself responsible not just for merchandise and profits, but for complex systems of supply, logistics, staffing, and trust. Thousands of employees depended on the success of decisions made far from the sales floor. The pressure of that responsibility followed him everywhere, turning success into a source of constant vigilance rather than relief. Financial strain intensified as the company pushed to stay competitive in a rapidly changing retail landscape. New stores meant higher overhead, long-term leases, and obligations that could not easily be reversed. While the public saw a growing empire, Penney saw balance sheets, debt schedules, and fragile margins. Prosperity looked impressive, but it rested on thin tolerances for error. This pressure seeped into his personal life. Rest became difficult, and confidence was frequently tested. Penney was not insulated from the consequences of failure. He felt them personally and deeply. Unlike leaders who could detach emotionally, he internalized the company's struggles as reflections of his own judgment and character. Each financial challenge felt like a moral test, not just a business problem. As expansion accelerated, so did isolation. Decision-making concentrated at the top, and Penney carried the burden largely alone. Advisors and executives could offer input, but the final responsibility rested on him. That isolation magnified stress, creating moments of doubt even during periods of apparent success. Growth did not bring peace. It intensified scrutiny, fear, and expectation. When economic conditions worsened, the pressure became crushing. The same expansion that once symbolized strength now exposed vulnerability. Fixed costs remained while revenue faltered, and Penney faced the reality that ambition had stretched the company to its limits. The empire's scale amplified both success and failure, leaving little room for recovery without personal consequence. In this way, rapid expansion reshaped Penney's life. It elevated him publicly, but drained him privately. The empire stood tall, but its weight pressed heavily on the man who built it, turning growth into one of the most demanding trials he ever faced. The mansion gradually transformed from a symbol of achievement into a space of isolation during Penney's later years. What was once intended to host warmth, reflection, and the quiet satisfaction of a life's work instead grew heavy with silence. The very size that once impressed visitors began to emphasize absence. Large rooms echoed without purpose, and corridors felt longer when walked alone. Celebration faded, replaced by contemplation and solitude. As pressures from the business world intensified, Penney spent more time withdrawn, carrying concerns that few around him could fully understand. The mansion, removed from the everyday rhythms of ordinary life, unintentionally deepened that separation. It became a place where thoughts lingered too long and worries had room to grow. Rather than offering escape, the house amplified stress, reminding him daily of the distance between public success and private strain. Social gatherings became rare. The joy of hosting diminished as emotional energy waned. Penney was not drawn to excess or spectacle. And in his later years, the effort required to maintain appearances felt hollow. The mansion no longer functioned as a gathering place, but as a quiet enclosure where time slowed and isolation settled in. Illness and exhaustion further narrowed his world. The weight of past decisions, financial losses, and moral responsibility followed him indoors. The mansion provided shelter, but not comfort. Its walls held memories of earlier optimism, making present struggles feel even sharper by contrast. What once symbolized stability now reminded him of fragility. Isolation also came from reflection. Penney was a deeply introspective man, and the mansion gave him space to question his choices, his beliefs, and the meaning of success. In that solitude, he confronted disappointment without distraction. The absence of celebration was not just social, but emotional. Achievement no longer brought satisfaction, and the house reflected that emptiness. In his later years, the mansion stood less as a home and more as a quiet witness to decline. It sheltered a man who had shaped American retail, yet offered little companionship in return. The isolation was not imposed by walls alone, but by the accumulation of stress, loss, and self-examination. What remained was a grand structure, holding a life in retreat, where silence replaced applause and reflection replaced reward. The Great Depression arrived with a force that shattered more than markets. It shattered certainty. For J.C. Penney, it struck at the very foundation of everything he had built. Years of disciplined growth, careful planning, and moral confidence were suddenly overwhelmed by an economic collapse no individual could control. The fortune that once symbolized stability and success unraveled with alarming speed, exposing how fragile even the strongest empires could be. As consumer spending collapsed, Penney's vast network of stores became a liability rather than an advantage. Fixed costs remained relentless while revenue shrank, and debts that once fueled expansion turned into crushing obligations. The scale that had elevated him now magnified his losses. Each closed register, each unpaid bill, echoed the reality that no amount of integrity or effort could shield him from systemic failure. What made this collapse especially painful was its visibility. Penney's name was not just attached to a company, it was the company. His personal reputation was intertwined with the business. And as the financial structure weakened, so did public confidence in his leadership. Newspapers, investors, and peers watched closely as his empire faltered. Failure was no longer private or abstract. It was public, documented, and discussed. This public unraveling struck at Penney's deepest values. He had built his life on responsibility and trust, and now he faced the humiliation of not being able to meet obligations to lenders, partners, and employees. The loss was not just financial. It was moral in his own eyes. He felt he had failed the people who believed in him, a burden heavier than bankruptcy itself. The emotional toll was severe. Penney suffered breakdowns, both physical and psychological, as stress, shame, and exhaustion converged. Once confident and decisive, he now questioned his judgment relentlessly. The depression stripped away the protective layers of success and forced him to confront vulnerability in front of a nation that once admired him. Unlike many who quietly retreated, Penney endured his collapse in full view. He did not disappear or deny reality. Instead, he faced the consequences of failure openly, even when it meant personal embarrassment. This confrontation was brutal, but it also revealed the depth of his character. He was forced to reconcile his ideals with a world that had suddenly changed the rules. The Great Depression reduced his fortune to fragments, but it did something even more profound. It forced Penney to confront failure not as a concept, but as a lived experience. In that confrontation, his strength was no longer measured by wealth or power, but by his willingness to endure loss with honesty and dignity. Giving away the mansion was not a single dramatic moment, but the final step in a long process of reckoning. Financially, the decision became unavoidable. The collapse of his fortune during the Great Depression left J.C. Penney burdened with debts and obligations that far exceeded his remaining resources. The upkeep of such a vast property, staff, maintenance, taxes, was no longer sustainable. What once felt manageable in times of prosperity became an anchor pulling him further under. letting go of the mansion was a matter of survival, not preference. Yet the decision went far beyond balance sheets and necessity. For Penney, money had always been inseparable from conscience. The mansion had long troubled him as a symbol of excess, and now it stood in stark contrast to the suffering he saw across the country. Millions of Americans were losing homes, jobs, and dignity. Holding on to such a grand residence during a time of widespread hardship felt morally dissonant to him. Even if he had been able to afford it, the question of whether he should weighed heavily on his mind. The mansion had also become emotionally burdensome. It no longer represented success or comfort, but isolation, stress, and reminders of failure. Each room echoed with memories of ambition and loss, making it harder to find peace within its walls. Giving it away was a way to release not only financial pressure, but psychological weight. It allowed him to step out from under the shadow of a life that no longer aligned with who he believed himself to be. This act was not an admission of defeat in Penney's eyes. Instead, it was an assertion of values. He believed that clinging to symbols of wealth during a moral crisis diminished a person's integrity. By surrendering the mansion, he reaffirmed his belief that possessions should never define worth. Responsibility mattered more than appearances, and humility mattered more than pride. There was also a quiet sense of accountability in the decision. Penney understood that leadership meant bearing consequences openly. Giving away the mansion signaled acceptance of reality, rather than denial. It demonstrated that he was willing to adjust his life to match new circumstances, even when it meant public acknowledgement of loss. Giving away the mansion became one of the most revealing choices of his life. It reflected a man who recognized when wealth had outpaced purpose, and when ownership conflicted with principle. The decision balanced necessity with morality, showing that for J.C. Penney, integrity remained intact even when fortune did not. Penney's legacy is defined far less by what he owned than by what he stood for. While mansions, fortunes, and corporate empires fade or change hands, the principles that guided J.C. Penney's life continued to shape American retail long after his personal wealth rose and fell. His impact was rooted in ideas, fairness, trust, and responsibility that outlived any physical symbol of success. At the core of his legacy was the belief that business should serve people, not exploit them. Penney insisted on honest pricing at a time when deception was common, choosing long-term trust over short-term gain. This approach reshaped how millions of customers interacted with retail, creating a sense of dignity in everyday transactions. That shift in expectation became part of the industry's foundation, influencing practices far beyond his own stores. His principles also extended to how he treated employees. Penney believed that workers were partners in success, not expendable tools. He promoted advancement from within and encouraged personal growth, reinforcing the idea that a company's strength came from character as much as profit. These values created loyalty and stability, leaving an imprint on corporate culture that persisted even as leadership changed. The collapse of his fortune did not erase his impact. It clarified it. When wealth disappeared, his principles remained visible. He faced failure openly, accepted responsibility, and adjusted his life without bitterness or denial. This response to loss became as instructive as his rise. It showed that integrity is not proven during success, but during hardship. Possessions once associated with his name, the mansion, the wealth, the public stature, became secondary footnotes in his story. What endured was the example he set. That success is hollow if it contradicts conscience, and that dignity matters even when power fades. His life demonstrated that values can survive market crashes, public criticism, and personal loss. Penney's true legacy lives in everyday moments, in the trust between customer and merchant, in ethical business standards, and in the idea that prosperity carries responsibility. He is remembered not as a man who accumulated greatly, but as one who believed deeply. In the end, his impact was measured not by what he owned, but by what he gave to the culture of business itself. In the end, the story of J.C. Penney is not a story about a mansion, a fortune, or even an empire. It is the story of a man who believed that character mattered more than comfort, and conscience mattered more than applause. He rose from nothing, touched extraordinary success, and then faced devastating loss without abandoning the principles that defined him. When wealth faded, integrity remained. Long after the mansion was gone, and the numbers on balance sheets were forgotten, what endured was his example. That true success is not measured by what we accumulate, but by the values we refuse to surrender, even when everything else is taken away.